All right. So today we're taking a look at the foundation, the beginning of something called the Roman Republic. Now, Rome is a pretty important place, and within ancient history, we could probably look at several different periods of Rome. In fact, we're going to look at least one more in coming weeks. Maybe not straight next week, but we'll come back to Rome at some point. But today we're looking at very early Rome, not the earliest of Rome, but very early. We're looking at about 2,500 years ago. So to give you some idea of the period of Rome that we're looking at today, it's pretty much the same time, or a very similar time, as the Parthenon is being built in Greece, and Athens is becoming the most powerful city in the world, or at least in the Western world at this point. People like Pythagoras are wandering around, Socrates and Plato, they'll be knocking around in Greece at this point, just to give you some idea of the time. The Colosseum, that massive, great big building in Rome. TJ has been to Rome. Maybe you've seen the Colosseum. But to give you some idea of the timing here, the Colosseum will not be built for over 400 years. So this is 400 years before the Colosseum even, which is pretty ancient. So yeah, we're talking very old Rome here. A bit different to, this is long before the time of the Roman emperors, so no Nero and stuff like that. Long before the time of Christianity. So yeah, we're talking a long time ago. And today we're going to focus really on the city of Rome. This is before Rome becomes a true empire. At the point where we're going to get to today, Rome is basically a city with a few little towns surrounding it. Yeah, there you go. Is Rome still around? Yes, Rome is still around. Not the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, let me see if I can get my dates right. I think that Roman Empire officially fell, the Western Roman Empire, sometime in the early 400 AD, when the tribes of the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals, they sacked Rome. But the rest of the Roman Empire actually survived until about 1435, when the Ottoman Empire came along and destroyed, or at least didn't destroy, they took Constantinople from the last ever Roman emperor, who was Constantine the 11th. There you go. So the Roman Empire is one of the longest running empires in history, but it doesn't exist anymore. There you go. That's TJ has seen the Colosseum. Excellent. Yeah. So the Colosseum isn't even a plan at this point. It's so ancient. Yeah. Yeah. Roman nature is meant to be going to Rome, but maybe not right now. Oh dear. Have to put up with me instead, I'm afraid. So, before we get to 500 BC, though, we're actually going to start in a time before dates. And we need to know the myths that lead to Rome. That's where we start here. So we're going to start with a few characters. Aeneas, who we're going to do an entire thing about on Friday, so I'm not really going to go into his details here. But just to say that this fella here, he leaves a city called Troy, way back in the mists of time. He leaves the Troy because the Greeks have destroyed the city. Troy is in Turkey. And Aeneas, he travels across the sea looking for a new homeland. And where he ends up is very near to what will become the city of Rome. And he will settle down. He will have his own little town, I suppose. Mini kingdom, if you want to be generous. But he starts to, as people do, have children, and his children have children, and their children have children, and blah, 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 blah. The family tree grows and grows. Until we get to another undetermined period of time. We're talking ancient here. No one quite sure what dates these are, because, well, we're not sure if these people exist, really. But the great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Aeneas, Romulus and Remus, a pair of twins, are born. Now, their mother is a noble of the family of Aeneas, but their father is Mars, god of war. So they're pretty powerful dudes. In fact, Aeneas himself, his mum was Venus. So there you go. All the gods are involved here, if we believe the stories. Cool, Kyle. Now, yes, TJ, I am on record. It's all good. It's all good. What do the names Romulus and Remus mean? I don't know if they mean anything particularly. I mean, if you know your Harry Potter, we can see some links here, though. Of course, Remus Lupin is, well, spoiler if you haven't read the third one yet, but Remus Lupin takes his name from Romulus and Remus, of course, because Romulus and Remus, they're two twin boys, and they are born to the princess. But unfortunately, during this time, the princess's evil uncle, has taken over the kingdom, and he's proper mean. Ooh. And he doesn't want the princess to have children, so he threatens to kill them. It's always child murder going on in these myths, isn't it? They always start the same way. But much like we saw last week with our tale of Cyrus the Great, the babies are saved. Twin boys, they're put into a basket, a bit like Moses, and they're put into the river, just chucked in there, and sent off on their way. Now, Romulus and Remus, at any normal time of history, would probably have died. Just to let you know, if you put two babies in a basket and chuck them in a river, they're probably going to die. But Romulus and Remus, they get lucky. Maybe they are blessed by the gods. But the river is swollen at this point. There's been a flood, so the river is wide and but quite shallow towards the edges, and so the basket kind of gets caught on the side of the river. It doesn't travel far. It doesn't go out to sea. And so the basket is then picked up by a she-wolf, a lady wolf. And the wolf takes the babies and suckles them and rears the babies as her own. Ah, how nice that is. Kyle, if you could please refrain from putting great big blank bits in the chat, because I cannot see what people are saying if there's loads of blank bits. Thank you. Oh, more people coming in. Let me see. Someone's saying I've frozen. Let me see if it's my problem or your problem. Here we go. Sometimes a little restart like that helps. Okay. So, Romulus and Remus, they are rescued by a wolf who raises them as her own children. So, wolf mama, human babies. Now, it is just like the Jungle Book. Yes, that's right. Oh yeah, my background has gone, hasn't it? Let me see if I can bring that back. Come back, strange background. Where did you go? There we go. Weird. So the babies, they live with the wolf for a while, you know, like babies do, but wolves can only look after babies for so long. And so as the boys grow older, you know, they learn to be able to walk and talk and hunt for themselves. The mother teaches them how to hunt, of course. They get strong and tough, and they end up coming back to the kingdom where their evil uncle has taken over. Evil uncle. And they end up fighting their uncle, defeating their uncle. There's a long, complicated story behind that, but we'll keep it simple today. And they manage to take over the kingdom. Now, this is where it gets creepy. Ooh. Oh, more people coming in. Here we go. What happens is Romulus and Remus, they are now in charge of what will become the Roman Empire. But they have no city, or at least not a city that they want. They've got the old city, but it's a bit boring. So they decide that they're going to found a new city, a great city, the greatest city on earth. And they go a-wandering. They move a bit south from where they started until they find two hills. Now, Romulus thinks that they should build a city on one of the hills, and Remus thinks they should build a city on the other hill. So they can't quite decide what to do. And then they decide, well, I know what we'll do. We will watch the skies and we will look for a message from the gods. Good question, Nadia. Do they talk wolf? I like to think they can at least communicate rudimentarily with wolves, yes. At least their mum. But maybe they forget it as they grow up. I don't know. The she-wolf now, she kind of disappears from the story because they've grown up now, and I assume she's gone off to do wolf things and they've gone off to do human things. But maybe every Christmas they meet up and have a nice meal, wolf and boys, and maybe they exchange gifts. They give the wolf a nice piece of meat. The wolf gives them whatever wolves give people, a bit of fur. I don't know. Hadn't really thought it through. But yeah, the wolf leaves the story at this point, unfortunately. So they sit down on their hills and they wait for a sign of the gods. Now, Romulus, let me see if I can get this right. I might get this wrong. The different twins. But Romulus is sat on his hill, and over the top there flies a vulture. Ooh, a sign of the gods that this is the correct hill. Yeah, a vulture has appeared in the sky over that very hill. Perfect. Now, the next, Remus, he's on his hill when 12 vultures fly by. And he says, aha, well, okay, your vulture flew over first, but I got 12 of them. That must mean a lot more than just one old vulture, even if it was the first vulture. And Romulus says, well, hang on, no, my vulture was like the first vulture, which means it was the first sign of the gods. Yours was just a coincidence. And they get into a bit of a scrap about it. Yes, Nadia. So, there's a reason why the city of Rome is called Rome and not Rheims, and that's because in the fight that ensues, Romulus kills his twin brother Remus, and he decides that his hill is the correct hill, and he builds his city there, and he names it after himself, Rome. Yeah, so if it had gone the other way, if Remus had won the fight, it probably would have been called Rem, which would be not maybe the Reman Empire. I don't know, it could work, I suppose. Rem. But this is the belief that the Romans have, that their city is formed through, one brother killing the other, brothers whose dad is the god of war and whose mum was a wolf. This is telling us that Rome is a bit of a tough, rough place. Does Romulus miss Remus? I imagine so. I imagine it's very awkward next Christmas when Mummy Wolf comes and they're like, where's your brother? I don't know why wolves talk like that, but they do now. Where's your brother? And Romulus is like, oh, sorry, accidentally killed him. Awkward. I don't know how she reacted. Maybe she got cross with big teeth. But this is the foundation of Rome. I mean, ironically, of course, Rome very quickly becomes so big that it covers both hills and then another 5 hills besides. So really, the whole thing was pointless. Oh, very, very sad. Now, our timeline now goes a little bit dodgy because we're going to fast forward through many, many centuries. We're not quite sure how many of Roman history until we get to a time of kings. Ooh, kings. Because, believe it or not, kings used to rule Rome. They're known as the Etruscan kings. That's kind of the civilization that the early Romans come from. They are the Etruscans, and they become the Romans. And the city of Rome at this point, we're looking here between, let's see, 600 and 500 AD, BC, sorry. Oh, that's a good question, Amelia and Benjamin. What's the difference in kings and emperors? So kings are usually in control of a city or a kingdom or maybe a country, whereas emperors are in charge of an empire. So a whole load of different areas. I mean, sometimes, to be honest, countries can be bigger than empires. I mean, so it's not a perfect rule. But yeah, basically, an emperor is a bit more impressive than a king because a king has control of one area, whereas an emperor has a control over a wide area. I suppose that's the simplest way to describe it. Good question, though. Superbus, yeah, superbus, of course. So there's a long line of kings. We haven't got time to go into the long line of kings. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what happens after the kings. We're going to talk about the Republic of Rome. But to do that, we need to understand a little bit about the 2 final kings, at least. Oh, dear. How do you pronounce their names? Okay, so our first king that we're going to talk about today is Servius Tullius. Now, Servius Tullius, the legend says, became king after being born a slave. He worked his way up through clever, yes, Severus Snape. Now, yes, you will notice a lot. There's going to be a Lucius, as we can see, a Lucius Malfoy here. J.K. Rowling, she liked her Latin names, so you're going to see a lot of Harry Potter references today if you're looking for them, for sure. So Servius Tullius, he is a slave. He becomes to power. And some people think he's a good king, some people think he's a bad king, but one person who thinks he's a particularly a slave, Kyle. Yes, so he was the lowest of the low, a slave in the city of Rome, and he built his way up to be the king of Rome through fighting and backstabbing and all this kind of stuff. There we go. Now, one person in particular who is not a fan of Servius Tullius is Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. This guy here, also known as Lucius Tarquinius Sextus. Now, we'll call him Lucius for today, just to make it simpler. But Lucius, he is not happy with Servius Tullius being king. He thinks it's an outrage that an ex-slave is in charge of Rome and the fair city, and he would rather be in charge himself. Now, unfortunately for Servius Tullius, Lucius has, the backing of Servius Tullius's own daughter. Dum dum dum, dramatic. So Servius Tullius's daughter teams up with Lucius to try and get rid of him. Ooh. Call him Superbus, please. Okay, Superbus. Those words are Romish. No, so the language isn't Romish, but that's a cool. I like that term. No, so these words are Latin. Yeah, the language of Rome is Latin. So yeah, these are Latin words, but I do like the word Romish. I might use that in the future. I quite like it. Yes. What do you speak? I speak Romish. Nice. So a very dramatic thing happens. Now, in Rome at this point, the king is in charge, but there is also a senate, a group of, we can imagine them as old wise men who sit around and help the king to make decisions. Sometimes the senate is powerful, sometimes it is weak, but there's always a senate there. And we need to imagine that Servius Tullius at this point is an old man, and he's there in the senate giving a speech. I don't know what about, but something. Oh, that's cool. Ella's been learning some Latin in school. That's very cool. I like that. Yes. Maybe when you go back to school, you can instead call it Romish and see how that goes down. Yes, old man, he's giving the speech, about being a king or whatnot. And and what he does is he's kind of wrapped up in giving his speech when Lucius comes in. Now, at this point, Lucius is much younger. He's much fitter. He's much stronger than this old king. And Lucius starts giving his own speech about how disgusting it is that Rome is ruled by a slave, and that he's a rubbish king, and that he's a smelly king, and he starts making all kinds of horrible accusations. And of course, Servius Tullius, the king, he starts shouting back, "Oh, you get out of here, sonny. I'm the king here." And one thing leads to another. Lucius Tarquinius picks up the king, drags him to the door of the Senate, and throws him down the steps. Ow! 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 Oh! Ow! That's the sound of Servius Tullius falling down the steps of the Senate of Rome. Dramatic. But it gets far more dramatic than that, because if you remember, I just mentioned that Lucius is teamed up with Servius's daughter. And Servius's daughter, we can see here in this picture. Here is the poor king. He's been thrown down the steps of the Senate, only to be run over by a chariot, controlled and driven by his very own daughter. Oh, the indignity, thrown down the steps and then run over in a drive-by by your own daughter, who is so angry at you because you're old and pathetic. Oh dear, this is a savage time in Rome. Oof, indeed. Oof. So, this is, that's the end of one king, and in comes another. But, unfortunately, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, a villain that he is, he starts to rule Rome with an iron fist of naughtiness. He is horrible to the people. If anyone complains, he has them killed. If he doesn't like the look of you, he has you killed. If you accidentally cough when walking past his house, he will have you killed. He is a mean and wicked ruler. And he gets particularly mean and wicked when it comes to a young lady called Lucretia. Now, let's keep the drama going. Lucius, we can see here from his dates, he rules Rome, from 535 BC to 509 BC. So 21 years he spends in control. But it's not going to last for too long, because one day Lucius does a terrible thing and he attacks the wife of one of his friends. In fact, one of his relatives. I believe it's his cousin. Ooh. Now, he attacks her, and she is so sad about being attacked that she stabs herself to death. And that's the very dramatic painting that we see here. She has killed herself. Now, into the room comes her friend, Lucius Junius Brutus. And he picks up the very knife that she used to kill herself. And he holds it aloft in the air, and he says these words. Ooh, here we go. He says, "By your pure blood, Lucretia, defiled by the cruel Prince Sextus, I vow to remove your father Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, his evil wife Tullia, and all of their children. Rome shall no longer be corrupted by kings." So he picks up a knife and decides that he's going to kill the king, the king's wife, and all the king's children. Do not mess with Brutus. Now, he doesn't quite go on the perfect murder rampage at this point. He is running around trying to defeat Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, and he gathers the people of Rome about him. He gathers the support of some of the senators, and he forces the king out of the city. Ooh. Now, if this was a normal time, Lucius Junius Brutus would simply be the next king of Rome. But he doesn't want to be the king of Rome. Brutus has a different idea. He decides that Rome shall be a republic. It's not just this one particular king he hates. He hates all kings. He hates the very idea of kings. He thinks that kings are tyrants, just bullies who push people around and kill people when they want to and do terrible things to other people's wives. So he decides he's going to come up with something quite different. And in this, we can start to see some similarities with Sparta. Not too many similarities, but yeah, we can. Can we have another look back at the dates for the kings? We will. Before we go into the Republic, we'll just have a little rewind on our dates here. So, our two kings that we're interested in here are Servius Tullius, who reigned from 578 to 535 BC, taken over, brutally killed by his own daughter with a chariot after being pushed down the stairs by this gentleman. Taken over by Lucius Tarquinius Sextus, or Superbus, depending on whether he's king yet or not, and that would be 535 to 509. There we go. And then we can see that there's a bit of overlap here, because this next date tells us the day, the life of Lucius Junius Brutus. He reigns, if reign we can call it, he is a consul, which I'll explain in a minute, from 509 to 505 BC. So he only survives 4 years, does Brutus, before being brutally executed himself. But maybe that's another story. I don't know if we'll have time for that today. So those are our dates there. Okay. Now, let's see what Rome was like during this time. A republic is a political system where the people get to decide who rules. No one just gets to rule forever, like a king does. Instead, people have a basic form of democracy where they can vote for people to represent themselves and to run the show for them. Now, what we need to understand is that there are two very different kinds of people in Rome. The biggest group, by far, would have been the plebeians, or the plebeians. Depends how you say it. I hear it both ways. Also known as the plebs, or the plebes. You may have seen or heard on TV and things people calling each other plebs or plebes, and this is where it comes from. Plebes, says Elizabeth. Okay. I'm not sure if one is an American pronunciation, one is in English. I hear different people say it both ways. But our plebeians or our plebeians, those are the normal people. They are out in the countryside. They're mainly farmers, just normal farmer Johns. In the city, they're craftspeople. They have businesses, shops, that kind of thing. They might have a stall attached to their houses. There might be bakers, blacksmiths, that kind of thing. So these are all useful people, but they're not very rich, and they don't get the same amount of power as the other kind of people. So the other class in early Roman society, and if this seems a bit simple to you, if you are a bit of a Roman expert out there, the class system of Rome will get much more complicated as time goes by. But right here at the start of the Republic, it's a bit simpler. Yeah, I mean, there will be a whole load of different classes that will be added in over the next 1,000 years. But, at this point, it's quite strange. Yes, Abby, I should have said your average Joe or Josephine. This is true. Or Joliet, or Jojobo. Your average Jojobo. So the other class are the patricians. Yes, now the patricians are the nobles. These are the people who own the land. They have great big villas or palaces. The legends say they are descended from the founders of the city. So these are people who were related to kings, or even, if you go back far enough, Romulus and Remus, and therefore Aeneas. But these people, at this time, it seems to have been quite fluid as to who was actually a patrician. There are references to plebs being made into patricians. Maybe they do something impressive in a battle, or maybe they just pay enough money, or maybe they marry into a rich patrician house family and become that way. Now, in later Roman history, the patrician class gets closed. There's no way, even 200 years later, that a pleb will ever become a patrician. You're stuck with what you're born with. But it seems at the first, no one's quite sure who's patrician and who's a pleb, so it's easier to go from one to the other. So the patricians, we can kind of imagine them as the rich people, the people walking around in their togas, maybe not being particularly busy, maybe having jobs like writing things down and signing stuff. Who came up with the names? That's a good question. These are all Latin words. So the Romans, I guess. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, of course, if you know a bit of Latin, you'll notice that some of these words are words that we still use today, whereas others of them aren't. Yeah. So yes, Romish. Sorry, Grace. Yeah, so Latin we see a lot around us. So yeah, some of these words will be familiar. Some of them you might be surprised at what they meant back then, and they might mean slightly different things now. But yeah, the people of Rome they're speaking Latin, so to them this would just be normal language. It wouldn't have been strange to them, of course. But exactly who's making the words up, I don't know. That's a tricky question. So, the patricians are the rich people. The plebs are the normal people. Now, there would also be an underclass, if you like, a big, wide amount of slaves running around the place as well. So a slave is worse than a pleb. To be a pleb is not really a bad thing. Yeah, it's not as cool as being a patrician, maybe. You're certainly not as well off. But you are respected, and you are a proper Roman citizen. If you're a slave, then you are someone who's basically been bought and is forced to do stuff, and you get no rights, and you don't get to join in elections and things like that. So there is, I suppose, a third class of slaves that is underneath these two. So both the plebeians and the patricians, they can go to the Senate, and they can have elections. Now, there's elections every year, or sometimes multiple times a year, depending on the exact job that they're representing. But here's a more modern picture of what the Senate would have looked like. This idea of the patricians all sat around in their white togas. They all look a bit bored, don't they? I mean, this guy here, he's giving a speech. Everyone's like, oh, yeah, all right. Oh, great. Tell me more about the price of wheat this year. It's amazing. But I suppose it's very similar to our Parliament today. If you see a modern picture of Parliament, you often see the MPs lying back, sort of half asleep, where someone's discussing, foreign policy with Kazakhstan or whatever they're talking about. The chairs do look uncomfortable, don't they, Roman nature? Yes, they do indeed. They, I suppose they're created really to try and keep these people awake more than anything else. So we can imagine that every now and again, the people would be invited to go to the Senate to vote for certain people to do certain important jobs. And here's a few here, and we'll add in another couple as well. The most important job in Rome, and this is where Brutus, here he is, Brutus, if we remember him with the holding up the knife, you can see just above him in this picture, there's a picture of two boys drinking milk from a wolf. Can we guess who that is? Who would be drinking milk from a wolf? Excellent, that's it. Yes, Remus and Romulus. So if we can zoom in, there you are. You can see the two boys drinking milk from a wolf. So that links Brutus, of course, to the past. Clever artistic way of doing it. Well done, guys. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. So Brutus becomes one of the first consuls of Rome. Now, I said it was a bit like Sparta, and it's like Sparta in this way. Because Brutus hated the idea of kings, he didn't just hate the individual kings, he hated the very concept of being a king. He refused to be a king himself. So he came up with this idea of being a consul. And just like in Sparta, where they had two kings, so one of them didn't get out of control, Rome was going to have two consuls. So Brutus shared the consulship. He was one consul. I can't remember who the other first consul was, but he had a friend doing the other job. Now, a bit different though in Sparta. If you are the king, you get to stay the king for the rest of your life. It's just you have a buddy king with you. The consuls, they can only be consul for 1 year. Now, you can have another go at being a consul. So you can be a consul for a year and then skip a year and then come back. It says here that they cannot be elected until 10 years had passed, and that was a bit later. The system that Brutus set up was you could be a consul, but then you had to have a year off at least, and then you could come back the next year. But this is to make sure that no one is too used to being in power. The power of Rome is shared out among things. Asma, why does Brutus hate kings? So he hates kings because he thinks they're bullies. He hates kings because they're always killing each other, doing horrible things like that. And he especially hates the last king, Superbus, because he hurt his friend who then killed herself. So, yeah, he's got a personal grudge against the last king. But yeah, he doesn't like the idea that kings are bullies and they do what they want. He thinks that it would be far more fair if it was the people who got to decide what happened, instead of these mad kings running around the place doing whatever they want to do. Yeah, okay. So the consuls, they get to do it for a year. There's two of them, just the same as in Sparta. Let's make sure that there's two people. So if one of the consuls turns out to be evil or mad or evilly mad or just madly evil, then the other consul is there to say, whoa, hold on, Brian. Put down that knife. Let's chill out a minute. Let's think about the situation. Yeah. And any decisions that were made about Rome had to be agreed by both of them. So the two consuls, if they got on well, Rome moved pretty smoothly because, of course, they would agree a lot of the time. Sometimes the consuls did not agree because they're elected by the people, and it might be that the people elect two very different consuls, who don't get on with each other. And so maybe for that year, the two consuls are arguing and having to come to compromises, and it would be tricky. But it would stop any one person running around with all the power. Now, this is true. Hang on, Josh. Abby has pointed out that he hates kings who kill people, but he killed the last king. Yeah, maybe there's a bit of hypocrisy there, isn't there? Yes. To be fair, Brutus will end up dead himself, so there you go. Now, Mega Gengar asks a good question there. What if both of the consuls don't agree? Well, the answer is nothing would happen. Eventually, say it's a really important decision, like, I don't know, do we go to war? We're being attacked. Do we get our soldiers together or do we hide behind the walls? If it's a decision like that, they're going to have to come to some kind of compromise. So it might be that one consul says, okay, look, I really want my idea to go forward, and you really want that other idea, you know, that other thing we were discussing yesterday, that thing about the boat with the duck's face, yeah? Well, if you let me grab the army and take it out and fight these guys, I'll let you build the boat with the duck's face, yeah? So they come to some kind of agreement, yeah? I don't know why you'd want a boat with a duck's face, but in fact, I want a boat with a duck's face. Um, So, the consuls, they had to work it out. That's what it is. It's all about teamwork for the consuls. They have to sort it out somehow. Um, Now, they're not there on their own, though. It's not just two consuls ruling everything. There are other important people that we see here. So we have magistrates. These were the officials who were appointed to be the judges, to make sure that the law was followed, not only by the people of Rome, but also by the consuls, because there are certain things that consuls can't do. You know, they have to agree with each other for a start. They can't threaten each other. They can't force each other to do things. So the judges, the magistrates, would be there, and we still have magistrates today. That's a word that you might be familiar with. If you commit a crime in this country, you might, well, if it's not too serious a crime, if it's a very serious crime, you'll go to a judge. But if it's a relatively less serious crime, I don't know, you've been speeding or something, then you might end up in front of the magistrate, who will tell you off and maybe make you pay some money, and in extreme cases send you to prison, but that doesn't really happen very often. The magistrates in Rome were very similar. These are the people that make sure that the laws are followed and decide whether people are innocent and guilty of crimes. They also look after the money for the city. So the consuls can only do things if they have enough money. And the magistrates are the ones who keep an eye on that. So the magistrates can turn around to the consuls and say, sorry, consuls, but we're not building that boat with a duck face because we just don't have the cash. And then, of course, the consuls would have to come up with some other idea, like, well, how about we take a duck and we chop off its head and we put the end of a boat on it? Yeah, a duck with a boat face. No, that wouldn't work. It would be weird and impractical. Um, so the magistrates were maybe a little bit different than judges as we think today. They would carry ceremonial axes around with them. Yeah, so we've got that's a good question, Adi. I'll come to that one in a second. But yeah, they would hold, as a mark of being a magistrate, they would have a great big wide sort of collection of reeds put together with a great big axe head on the top. So these are the kind of magistrates that you do not want to mess with, because, well, they are armed and dangerous. Yeah. Now, Nadji's got a good question there. What if the magistrates stole the money? And I'm sure that there must have been dodgy magistrates who were up to no good. I'd like to think the other magistrates would step in and stop them, but who knows? Yes, I'm sure there must have been, like there are in our own societies today, there must have been good people and bad people, good magistrates, bad magistrates. So. Now, we've also got the tribunes, or the tribunes. Those were appointed to protect the ordinary people against unfair treatment. So these are like the people of the plebs, if you like. The plebs would have their own tribunes, whose job it was to look after the interests of, you know, the common man. Let's make sure that the consuls and the magistrates aren't making laws that only help the patricians. Let's make it so that the patricians aren't walking around the city punching plebs in the face and getting away with it. Let's make sure that, you know, the Senate, which we'll come to in a minute, and the magistrates and the consuls, they understand the problems of the farmers or the miners or whatever we're talking about. Yeah. Behind me is a picture of, well, this is a model which I think is in a museum in Italy, but it's a model of what Rome would have looked like 2,500 years ago. So at this period, this is what Rome would have looked like if we had looked at it from above. Lots of red brick roofs. You can just, all those sort of reddy colours behind me are Roman villas with red slate roofs on them. Yeah. Yes, slave. Oh, then can I be free? Consul. No, that's going too far. Yes. Now, so the tribunes would have the voice of the people. They would often be the really popular guys. Yeah, the magistrates would be kind of the dull kind of accountant, lawyer kind of guys. The tribunes would be like the celebrities. If you think, you know, Donald Trump, if he was around today, he would probably get a good job as a tribune, you know, because he's quite popular, but he's probably not quite so sensible or serious to be a magistrate. So maybe in Rome we would have seen Donald Trump as a tribune. I don't know. It's hard to think about it. Now, there were also people called censors. it was the censor's job to make sure that the morals of the city were kept, that nobody was doing any untoward, rude things. People aren't walking around covered in mud or getting married to the wrong kind of people. The plebs and the patricians aren't mixing. Their job would be to make sure that the temples were kept nice and that the statues were respected. And people weren't coming along in the night and drawing mustaches on the pictures of Venus or something. All this kind of stuff, trying to make rules about how people should live their lives in a good way, not running around gambling all the time or fighting or being uncouth and swearing in the street. So the censors, and we still use that word today, censorship, if something out there in the public is deemed too rude, we might put a label on it that says censored, or we might put a label on it that says caution, you can only watch this film if you are 18, that kind of thing. So they're not quite the Roman police, they're more the Roman moral police. They're the people sort of sticking their nose in. They're the nosy neighbours, the censors are, going around making sure that you're behaving yourself. They're the kind of guys that if you were having a party in a park, you got some music on and everyone's dancing around a bit, they're the kind of person that would come up and go, excuse me, but you're being very noisy, turn your music down. There are people trying to sunbathe in this park, there's people trying to play. You're being very rude. And so the censors would then kick them out of the park, I imagine, and that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, there's a good question. What if the tribune didn't like the plebs? Now, later in history, I'm not sure exactly what the tribunes were like at this very point in history, but later in history, there were certainly very, very crooked tribunes who would put on this great big act about how they loved the common people and how the common people were wonderful and they really love farming. Just the other day, I was down at the farm stroking a piglet. Oh, it was wonderful. I do love to farm. And then they'd get voted in. And then they turn around and go, ha ha ha, I don't like any common, horrible, smelly people. Actually, I'm just here to make a lot of money. Ha ha ha. So there's certainly plenty of tribunes who do that in history. But there's also some wonderful tribunes who truly do sacrifice a lot of their time and effort just to help out the poor people. So, like in all times in history and like in all societies, there are good guys and bad guys. How did Romulus kill his brother? That's a good question, Asma. What does he do? I believe does he strangle him? I think he might strangle him, but I'm not sure. It's been a while since I've read the myth, so yeah, I think it's a strangulation job, but I'm not sure. Yes, ghost henchman. Often it does come down to money, 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 money. Yes. There's a good question. Yes, Nadia asks if women could be any of these things. Oh dear. Can you imagine it? Unfortunately not. No. Rome, like Greece at this time, is rather sexist. There are no female magistrates or consuls or tribunes. That's not to say that Roman women weren't powerful, because they certainly could be. We already saw how one girl killed a king by riding over him in a chariot. And in fact, one of Superbus's criticisms of Tullius was that Tullius had only come to power because of an impressive woman who helped him out. So if you wanted to be a powerful woman, you could be. You just have to be married to a powerful man and be poking him around, which, that's how it goes. That saying, behind every great man is a great woman, was definitely true in Rome. But yes, they couldn't officially be a consul or a magistrate or a tribune or anything. If you were the wife of a consul, a magistrate, and a tribune, it would be like being, almost as good as being one yourself, because everyone would respect you and, you'd have very nice clothes and all this kind of stuff. But yes, it wouldn't be quite right. Oh, this is a good question from Lewis here. Were there sewers in Roman times? Now, in later Rome, for sure. At this point, I don't think they've invented the sewer system yet. That, during the height of Rome, if we fast forward about 400 years to the time of the Colosseum and things, then yes, we're looking at aqueducts and loads of sewer system, underfloor heating, all this kind of stuff. At this early period, it's not quite that fancy yet. So as far as I know, I don't think the sewer system has been created yet. Oh, Mega Gengar is telling me that Romulus stabbed his brother, didn't strangle him. There you go. Yeah. Yes, very good. Oh, there's another good question from Ella. Could women vote? No, women cannot vote. So not only can they not have any of these jobs, but they cannot vote for the men who do have these jobs either. Again, bit of a caveat though. We do know in history that women can be quite persuasive. Yeah, so I'm sure there was more than one patrician who turned up on voting day after having been punched by his wife, and she's made him go and vote for John when he really wants to vote for Jim. And she's like, "Oh, you come back to this house unless you voted for John." Ooh. So, there's power there, but it's not on the surface. That's for sure. Okay. Very rude. It is rude. Yes. John or Jim, you decide. Now, once there is an underlying group here that we haven't mentioned yet, which we should do because we're running out of time. But down here we have the Senate. Now, the Senate, we already mentioned it. It exists during the time of kings, but now the Senate starts to get a little more powerful under Brutus. When you're a magistrate, after you've done your job for a few years, you can retire, and then you can go and join the Council of Old Men, the Senate. We'll just go back to our... So we'll come back to our picture of the Senate for this one. Here we are. We'll remind ourselves. So these guys, they all come from the patrician classes, because you cannot be a magistrate unless you are a pleb. If you are a pleb, sorry. So you have to be a patrician. So the Senate would be full of usually old men, because you've got to have been a magistrate and retired before you can even get into the door. The senators usually stay there for life unless you do something particularly wrong and the censor comes and gets you or something. You're a senator for life. And the Senate, in the early days, it's not particularly powerful. They definitely give advice to the consul and they give advice to the magistrates, which they're in a good position to do because they've all been magistrates before. So if anyone's going to advise the current magistrates on how to do their job, they've got like this huge room full of experienced older men to help them out. So that's pretty good. Yes, I'm not sure. I think this is a picture of some dramatic part of Roman history. Asma is pointing out this man who's sitting alone. I think that is probably significant. I just found this picture of the Senate, so for our purposes, I'm not quite sure who that is. Yeah. So yeah, the Senate, they're in a sort of advisory guiding role. They would have helped with the consuls. One good thing about senates or senators, the people who live in the senates. Oh no, he's a senator, Kyle, because he's wearing the senator clothes there. But yeah, exactly who he is, I'm not sure. Nadia is asking, what if a pleb pretended to be a patrician and became a magistrate and then went into the Senate? Now that's the other job of the censors, which I didn't mention. That's a good question. The censors, the reason they're called a censor, we use the word censor as in like stopping bad things happening or cutting stuff out. A census is a counting of the people. So the censor's job, other than just being the moral police, was every year to go around Rome and to count everyone up, put down everyone's name in a huge great big list, and then to write down whether they are plebs or patricians. Yeah, so the censor is making sure that everyone in the city is on one of these lists. They're on the pleb list, they're on the patrician list, and that list is final. Once the censors have made it, that's where you are. So the idea that a pleb could then become or sneakily become a patrician just by pretending would have been very difficult, because the censors would have your name and address written in their book and they would know exactly who you were. And because the patricians, they all came from the same families, there's all these noble families of Rome, they all knew each other and most of them were related to each other in some way. So if you just showed up one day and were like, hello, I'm your great aunt and uncle, it would have to be, wouldn't it? I'm your great uncle Phil. Yeah, you haven't heard of me, but I've been living over there behind that bush. People would be pretty suspicious. Yeah, they would know that you weren't one of them. But yeah, so a good idea then, Andrew. What if you're on holiday when the censors came counting? I think it took probably the best part of the year to actually do the counting in the first place. So I assume there were always people, missing off the census who would be added on later. Yeah, I guess. And I'm not sure how big holidaying was back then. It was hardly as if you could just pop off to the south of France. The south of France was full of barbarian ghouls. No. You couldn't just pop over to Greece, or Egypt. People did travel, but maybe not so much for holiday. It was usually for learning and things like that people travelled, or trade. So, yes, good question though. So later in history, the Senate will become more and more powerful, and eventually the Senate will end up ruling Rome. Yeah, the censors, sorry, not the censors, the consuls, their job will get less and less important, and the Senate will take over. And being a senator for a long time in Roman history will be as good as it gets. Yeah, that's about as powerful as you can be. Um, the Senate, and next time we visit Rome, we'll have a look at this. The Senate, the Republic, this system, will be overthrown by Julius Caesar, he of Caesar fame. I don't know. And then the line of emperors will start with the Emperor Augustus. But that's a good, well, nearly 500 years in the future from this. So we're going to have about 500 years of the Republic, the senators, the consuls, the magistrates, the censors, and the tribunes being in control of the people. And it's important to point out that they are going to make Rome incredibly powerful. Now, Emmy's got a good question there. How many people live in Rome? At this time, I don't know. We're not looking at, two big numbers. We're looking at thousands. So it would have been, it would have been fairly easy to go around and take a census. You can count thousands of people. It would be harder if it was like 1 million or something. But we're not talking those numbers. So yeah, the picture behind me is nice, isn't it? Yeah, it is nice. Now, before we go, we should probably just mention that this system, once it gets up and running, is pretty good. Yeah, it works pretty well. It's quite a nice equal system. Generally speaking, people are happy with it. Not always, but it has its problems. But in these early days of Brutus, when he becomes the first consul, he has an issue, because it's not as if he comes in, he becomes consul, he sets up the Republic, and he goes, yep, done, cool, everyone's peaceful now. No, the family of Superbus is out there, the Tarquin family, and they will keep on attacking Rome over and over again. And in fact, in one attack, they will grab hold of Brutus only 4 years in, and they will execute him in public. Now, that gets a little bit complicated. There's lots of back and forth here. But essentially, we've got years of civil war with the people of Rome fighting against the family of the dead king, who just keep trying to take over. And, eventually they get beaten completely and there are no more kings. But at this point in history, this is the birth of the Republic, and people are just sort of, getting to understand what being part of a democracy in a republic feels like, and they're generally enjoying it. Yes, Julius Caesar, he of the leaves in his hair, his laurel wreaths, that's it. All right. One last question before we go then. Who wants to join Zero? I don't know what that means. They ask, when were roads invented? Now, there were definitely roads at this point. Maybe not the great Roman highways that we know from later history, but yeah, they're definitely using roads already by this point. Oh, hang on, I've got okay, I've been asked to leave the meeting instead of close the meeting. We'll see if that works. Okay. All right, so we'll leave it there for today, guys. Oh, no, not tomorrow. Tomorrow there is none of this. But on Friday, we will look, if we go right back here, we will look at the myth and the legend of Aeneas. We will see where he came from. He who is even more legendary than Romulus and Remus, who were pretty legendary themselves. So there you go. So I'll sign off right now. I might have to end the chat, I'm afraid, because I don't think it stops recording otherwise. So we will end it there. Thank you very much, and I will see you on Friday. Ooh, zoom out.